Everyone. Hello. Hello, everyone. Hello. Up the back there. Hello, Vince. That's it. Thank you, Patrick. Hello, everyone. Oh, there we go. Bit of volume. My name's Christy Anthony, and I'd like to acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional owners of the Adelaide Plains. Welcome to Take That. I'll take that as a comment. Before we start, a couple of housekeeping things. Somebody's dropped a Wilson parking ticket from 9:20 or so this morning, which will be like a disaster later today if it's you. So it's out there at the front reception area. So check for your ticket if you took one. Great. Comments are fabulous. I'm sure you've all got many of them and you'd like to contribute to what's already happened today. I'm actually going to start with reading out a few from the online forum. There's been quite a lot of commentary and chat online. So for those of you, I don't know where the camera is, but hello, we can hear you. You're part of this. There. Oh, there you are, of course. Hello. These are a few that are just some comments that I'll throw into the arena for you all in this room in relation to what we've just heard. So from Melinda Rackman, she says, in Europe, they have 5 minutes of arts news in the TV news, and it's a vital part of our culture. Agreed. John Irving's online, and he says, the accessibility question, I think, is critical. Kids grow up with sport all around them. They experience this firsthand. Those kids that experience music or theatre firsthand as they grow up will be far more likely to stick with music and theatre as they age. Agreed with Julia. And Rory McLeod says, in the US, there was something called National Theatre, the National Theatre Project, which was introduced as a response to the Great Depression, which provided work for artists and tradies and actors and writers and generally brought a sense of community. There are plenty more comments online and we'll be calling for more comments towards the end of the day. Remember, you know, when you get a great panel together and then you call for questions, somebody stands up and makes a comment. Well, this is the moment for all those comments and more. And so I'm going to jump straight into it. Today, we've got 5 people who have submitted comments, and this is their soapbox. So I'll introduce each speaker and hope that they'll provoke you enough to ask questions, but we'll actually keep moving, and I'll ask you to hold your questions and your own comments, including perhaps comments from earlier today, till the end of until all 5 speakers have spoken. So we're just going to rock straight into it. So first up, we have Dr. Heather Robinson. Heather is a creative producer and an aspiring documentary maker who completed her PhD on value and cultural institutions in 2020 as part of the Flinders Laboratory Adelaide team. Heather has 2 ideas about how the arts sector should stop counting their audiences and start listening, to recapture our own language and share our stories of value. So please, over to you, Heather. Jump up, take this, and make your comment.
Thank you, Christy.
Yes, well,
My time starts now. Thank you all. What a great day. Now, how would I change the arts and cultural sector? Here we go. Last week, I heard the amazing Indigenous author and advocate Jackie Huggins speak at Flinders University. She made a statement in aid of reconciliation to the effect of, judge us for who we are and what we do, not for who you want us to be and what you want us to do. This resonated with me as something similar to the predicament in which the arts and cultural sector finds itself. We are judged or evaluated for what others want us to be and do, not for who we are and what we actually do. In some ways, we've become complicit in creating this situation. My experience has been that people who work in our sector, though, tend to do it for the reasons more to do with public value. And yes, I'm that old that I actually remember it being in mission statements. We like to contribute to the community rather than someone's profit margin, although we're also very good at doing that. We collaborate, we get along, and we keep the doors open and the lights on by joining forces with people who share our values. When I was doing museum studies quite some time ago, we were encouraged to adapt to the language of the commercial sector so we could better identify such organisations who shared our values, so we could maximise the partnership opportunities. What could possibly go wrong? Well, along with government in reaching out and adapting to the commercial sector in hopes of constructive collaboration, which we're all used to doing, we've inadvertently jeopardised not only our own language and our own way of conducting our businesses. This has also given leeway to successive governments to reduce both their funding and the moral responsibilities that they have as stewards of our sector. Under growing pressure to comply with managerial imperatives and bureaucratic diktat, we're in danger of losing sight of what we do and who we do it for, the public. This is why we're here today. So what would I do about it to change? I'd do two things. I'd stop counting and I'd start listening more. A large part of my research has been exploring ways of engaging with the public as the ultimate arbiters of the public value generated by cultural institutions. In my case study, it was the State Library of South Australia. By engaging with members of the public directly and making provisions so that they could speak in their own natural language and express their views in their own terms without prescribing them scales or definitions, we can identify what matters most to the people we work for. Research shows that such articulations or narratives of value are a more authentic benchmark for evaluation purposes, the goalpost setting for organisations to check their strategies, their planning and their visions against. This is not, mind you, about measurement and may be difficult to put on a spreadsheet. But as we already know, not everything that counts can be measured. I would like to see members of the public, the users, the audiences, the visitors, the friends and the fellows, as well as the partners and sponsors, having equal voice when it comes to authentic benchmarking processes as part of a policy reset. This is a far more appropriate means of reflecting what we do, especially if we include it with my second idea. And that is, we need to rebalance the scorecard. I know we're using a lot of sports metaphors today, but I think this is important. Did you know that there are 2 pages in the annual reports from the State Library, the Museum, the Art Gallery and the Adelaide Festival that are dedicated to recording and analysing complaints made by the public? 2 pages of tables split into complaint categories, subcategories, examples and the all-important number of complaints. There is also a box under additional metrics to record the number of positive feedback comments, though they are not itemised or tabulated. You don't have to be an accountant or Treasury official to see that the number of positive comments outweighs the negative by 10 or even in some cases 20 to 1. By not giving equal weight or page space to the public positive comments, the official performance records of our major cultural institutions are skewed to only negative public voices, only telling the bad news. We know that these places are more than their complaints, but how can the recipients of these documents know the whole story if they only have the downside, even if they do take the trouble to read them in the first place? So, I suggest our major institutions and every organisation of whatever scale who sends a similar report to government to include the public feedback. Thank you, the positive public feedback. We cannot be so cynical and accept that they are not read. If they are not, Treasury is not doing their job and should be held accountable. They are avoiding the opportunity to learn who we are, avoiding or ignoring, you decide. We need to redress the balance. We need to include the positive feedback in the voices of the public and centre those voices within policy development. I'd even go so far as to not submit your annual report until you're given space to tell your whole story. That's my provocative bit in case you missed it. What would they do? Turn the tap off? I'd really love to see the headlines that would generate. Okay, I am working on my first documentary project, a series on evolution. I've learned that if a species keeps adapting to their environment, they become over-specialised. They become too dependent and often fragile. and are at greater risk of extinctions when things change. It's time for our sector to stop adapting to a political environment that is increasingly hostile. Instead, we have to do what humans have unfortunately become very good at. It's time for us to push back and start shaping the environment to suit us, starting with the annual reports, a small but important step to create space for our whole story, our truth-telling, where we can be judged for who we are and what we do, for those we do it for. After all, the cultural sector and governments are supposed to be working for the same people, and that is the public. So governments come and go, but the arts are forever. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Heather. A call to action to all of you to flip your annual report, to delay it, or whatever it takes to add that positive commentary and extraordinarily perhaps look at the critical nature of complaints. Okay, next up, thank you, Heather. We have Greg Ogle. Greg has a doctorate in political economy, over 20 years experience in charitable organisations, and is currently the Senior Policy and Research Analyst for the South Australian Council of Social Service. He'll be challenging us to support the removal of tax deductibility for donations to arts and charitable organisations, but emphasises that this is an argument derived from a broader politics and not SACOS's policy position. Please welcome Greg.
Thanks, Christy. And yes, this won't win me many friends at work, given that SACOS represents most of the state's largest welfare charities. But I propose removing tax deductibility for donations to the arts and to charities generally, because it will increase public accountability and fairness in funding. The idea is raised by French economics rockstar Thomas Piketty, whose work's been pivotal in highlighting growing inequality around the world. Amongst other things, Piketty argues that tax-deductible donations empower and reward the preferences of the rich. He's largely looking at grand endowments to American and French universities, not my $20 a donation, $20 a month donation to whoever, but the argument's the same. This is basically public money that should be going into the tax pool, but is instead retained and directed and expended by private individuals and corporations. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting banning private donations to the arts or to charities, just that those donations should not be tax deductible, and that the extra tax revenue gained by the government should then be used to fund activity in those same areas through transparent public funding processes. Federal budget papers suggest that around $1.9 billion per year is forgone in tax revenue because of tax deductibility for charities. That's across all charities. My back of envelope guess is, or calculation, whatever, is that arts share is about $50 million a year in receipts lost to private arts funding. To put that in context, that's about 20% of the funding for the Australia Council, and it's 5 times the funding of the Creative Partnerships Program. So we're talking about a fair bit of money that could be going into peer-assessed, public-funded programs. Of course, that data assumes that the total tax deductions simply switch from private tax deductions to government money, and economists will tell us that that won't happen. But the key question is what happens to the total funding overall? And it's possible that total arts funding would actually increase if donations didn't drop by the same amount as the tax revenue gained. That's possible. If philanthropists and donors dropped their donations by the same amount as the tax deduction, then it would have net zero impact on the total funding for the arts sector. But the bigger question is, if we oppose removing tax if we oppose removing tax deductions because we think philanthropists will stop donating, what does that say about our view of philanthropists and about how we value the arts? Are we really just a tax avoidance plan? And are our donors really simply that self-serving? Where's the confidence in the public value propositions that we were talking about earlier? My proposal also has a good side benefit. in that for the last 20 years, Conservative governments and think tanks have used tax-deductible status of charities to attack them and constrain and threaten their ability to advocate for change. This is most prevalent in the environment movement, where tree planting is charitable, but stopping trees being cut down is not. Removing tax deductibility from all charities would also remove this piece of government leverage over charities and allow them to actually pursue their mission and their purpose in the way that they want to without having to worry about archaic charitable law. And also enable peak bodies like AICSA to fundraise on the same footing as the rest of the arts sector. And that would apply to all the other sectors as well. Look, obviously there's devil in the detail of this proposal. Tax deductions would have to be removed from all charities, so you didn't have a choice, as you do now, between donating to a tax deductible charity or one that's not tax deductible. We'd need to ensure that any revenue actually went back to arts and charitable programs, not to consolidated revenue or was lost or spent on submarines. And the government processes that money would go into need to be transparent and peer reviewed, not a catalyst, that's a capital C, not a catalyst for ministerial pork barrelling. These are, but let's face it, they're just implementation issues. They're not reasons to continue privileging the preferences of corporations and individuals over the democratic public processes. For those of you who do have significant private donations, don't panic. This isn't going to happen anytime in the near future. But it is important because it should provoke big picture questions about the role of arts and charities and about who we serve and who we're accountable to. And it should challenge the neoliberal views that government funding is a social cost and private funding is somehow validated because it relates to a market. And mostly, and finally, I think the big question we should be asking is, are we happy that our sectors, arts, welfare, are we happy that our sectors are funded in a way that reflects and increases inequality?
There's food for thought. Wow, he's really put a lot of thought into that, haven't you, Greg? That's exciting to find not only that we might abandon the unequitable status of charitability and find $50 million in the process in a year. Fabulous. I'm sure there'll be comments and questions and a lot of thinking on that. Our next speaker is Yamala Alfonsetti, who'll be familiar to you as the Executive Director of the State Opera of South Australia. Today, she'll propose a post-COVID response to employment for funded arts companies.
Thanks, Christy. It's lovely to be here. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces and friends in the audience. I'm glad to hear that my chairman, John Irving, is listening online. This will give me an opportunity to prove to him that I can make a point in under 10 minutes. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces in the audience because it makes me realise that I will be preaching to the converted and offering a way forward, which I think is an important next step for major performing arts companies in this country. I want to start by offering a question. What is a company? A British economist that I like to read, who writes a lot about company structures, named John Kay, he writes, companies have no immortal soul. They live and die just like human beings. But while they live, they prosper by the attributes of their personality. Now, I'm someone who believes that a company doesn't have a personality. A company, in fact, is nothing but a legal construct. It's a nexus of contracts. It's a set of terms of reference. It's articles of association. It's essentially nothing. The only thing that a company, especially a performing arts company like the one I run, can do is employ people and pay them. Employ them to practice their craft and pay them to create art. So how do we create the personality in our companies that we so crave? CEOs, executive directors, managing directors, boards of management, we all like to think that our company has intrinsic worth an identity, a meaning, and a purpose. It doesn't have anything intrinsic about it. Recently, someone I greatly admire, Eamon Flack, Artistic Director of Belvoir Street Theatre, wrote, I think it was in Limelight, "We now have a theatre sector without actors." And he's obviously speaking to the ravages that we've all experienced over the last 18 months to do with COVID. He didn't push his argument further than that, unfortunately. Following on from that, another fantastic writer, actor and director, Humphrey Bower, wrote a piece which put in words a direct shot across the bow to arts companies. He said, every publicly funded performing arts company should have at least 50% of employees who are practicing artists. He stated what we've all been talking around and what many artists have started to vocalize, but which hasn't been endorsed by the decision makers of these companies. So boards haven't endorsed this, executive directors haven't endorsed this, but artists are calling for it. So as shocking as this sounds, I would like to propose that the next thing that we do as major performing arts companies is revert to or adopt what I call the company model. Many arts companies already do this. Symphony orchestras, ballet companies, they employ artists in a part-time or full-time ongoing capacity to practice their craft. But what about opera companies and theatre companies and venues and festivals and galleries? I propose that this is a way to deliver the personality to these companies that we so crave. What's missing? How can we do this? Well, we currently have a set of KPIs enforced on us by our state and federal government funders that we have to deliver upon to secure our funding. We're now at the end of year one of a 4-year funding cycle for the National Performing Arts Partnership Framework. There are about 38 major performing arts companies in that framework, and that's just performing arts. That's not festivals who are part of the Major Festivals Initiative, etc. There is time in the next 2 years to prosecute this idea. It will take a long time to socialise. It will take a long time to build into the next set of 4-year funding cycle contracts. But there is a way to do it, and it is to get the bean crunchers to look at the portion of our funding and the percentage of what that is as part of our turnover, cross-reference that with our full-time equivalent staff requirement, and work out what they can reasonably mandate in a KPI to multi-year publicly funded performing arts companies to make them put artists on the books as permanent, ongoing employees to practice their craft. The other thing that is missing is the voices of boards and CEOs and executive directors in this argument, amplifying the voices of artists and standing in solidarity alongside artists. This is the way that we will deliver what we think we already have in our companies, personality and identity. Thank you.
Sorry, I confused you. Yamila's got the launch this evening. Good luck with that. So she won't be joining the panel here, but I'm sure that there'll be other opportunities to grab her tomorrow. Yeah, all day. Good. Okay, so fantastic. We've brought back the company model. I recall that as a kid growing up in Adelaide. Junction Theatre. Oh, look, yeah, look, we could go on, but yeah, that's a very exciting concept indeed. It actually segues nicely into our next speaker, who is Kate Larson. Kate is an arts and cultural and not-for-profit consultant with more than 20 years' experience in Australia, Asia, and the UK. With particular interest and expertise in arts governance and cultural leadership, Kate will be talking about what we need from arts boards, or whether we need them at all. Kate.
Hi, I am never more aware that when we come together to talk about arts and culture, that we do so on the land of the oldest living continuing culture in the world. And that's an extraordinary thing and an extraordinary privilege to be part of and to be with you all today. For our blind and vision impaired colleagues, I'm a light-skinned woman in my mid-40s. I have dark, short hair, dark rimmed glasses, big earrings, and I am proudly and gratefully wearing a badge that's announcing that I am COVID vaccinated. And I'd like to also acknowledge everybody in the last 2 years who has worked to make us safe, even if that continuing work means we are all still not able to be together in the same room. I also feel really lucky to be in this space in particular, because most, if not all of us in this room and online are in some way part of the hugely messy and even more misunderstood landscape of arts governance in Australia, in that we report to boards, or we report to the people who report to boards. We apply to the organisations that those boards oversee for our jobs and our grants and our opportunities, or we're board members ourselves. But this governance model is broken. Even when they're working well, our arts boards are usually much harder work than either board members or staff members would like. And we all know that a good board can turn into a bad board in the space of one AGM. As a consultant, I now hear the horror stories almost every day. So we're talking about nightmare boards, negligent boards, boards that don't stay in their lane, boards that overreach, that mismanage or micromanage, boards that aren't as diverse, aren't anywhere near as diverse as the communities they represent, or that quite simply just create more work than the benefits they provide organisations in return. Boards that fail again and again in their duty of care to the people they employ. Boards who damage good CEOs or can't manage bad ones, or fail to support the people that those CEOs fail in their turn. Boards that don't review their own processes. Boards that don't even measure their organisation's success. Boards that get glassy-eyed when asked to get involved in fundraising, or very quickly edge towards hostile when asked to give, get, or get out. Boards that have quite simply lost our trust. And of course, it's not universal. There are good boards and there are even better board members. But the problems our sector is facing are real, and they're endemic, and they're cyclical. Because essentially the model is the same. So whether we're looking at low regulated incorporated associations, or more closely monitored limited companies, or even government statutory authorities, essentially Australia's not-for-profit governance model, as we know, puts a team of unpaid or low-paid volunteers in charge of a team of paid experts. Many of those volunteers have little or tangential experience. Most have never run comparable arts organisations. And in my experience, most of them don't understand the difference between what the legislation requires of them, what the organisations need from them, and what they personally want to get out of that experience. Best case, let's be generous, this is an idiosyncratic situation, but one in which the free access to expertise and networks can be hugely beneficial to those organisations. But we all know in this room, I've seen lots of nodding, that the situation it creates is most often problematic at best. And it makes our organisations dependent on volunteers who are often ill-equipped and ill-supported to give our organisations what they need. But of course, the harsh realities of everyday relentless organisational survival necessarily make us more focused on making the best of the situation, even if we know it's a bad one, rather than having the headspace to imagine how it could change, which unfortunately means that governance issues, when things go wrong, they often go unnoticed or more usually unaddressed for long periods of time, if at all. So far, so business as usual, right? But if our boards and board members are failing, it's because they're being set up to do so. So in most cases, I am convinced that the causes of this kind of endemic board dysfunction can be directly traced back to the failings of the governance model itself, by which I mean the strictures and the hoops of the Incorporated Associations Act and the Corporations Act that simply shouldn't be the self-fulfilling prophecies that they've become. In that the primary reason our arts orgs have arts boards is because the legislation tells us we have to. The books of the boards that we turn to for guidance only tell us how to make the best of this current situation rather than thinking about how it might change. And that's making the best of that current model is the same thing that the governance training and consultancy industry, and myself included, makes our living, often by asking organizations who can least afford it to invest again and again for each new generation of board members. But now, right now, more than ever, our sector doesn't have these resources to spare, either to support that perpetual cycle of governance training or to address the damage that the bad boards are leaving in their wake. Ours is a sector that has had to learn to bend without breaking. We're really good at it. But in this case, maybe a break is what we need to throw out the model and start again. Those of us that re-emerge in a post-pandemic world are going to need to rebuild stronger than ever. And that includes fit-for-purpose governance models that give us what we really need, something that serves our sector rather than something we have to serve. Thank you.
So we've got rid of the annual report. Oh no, we haven't, we just adopted it. And now the board. Wow. Can I just have a show of hands? Who's here is on a board? Yeah, over half, almost half, at least, you know, a good third of the audience, which is intriguing because I bet you've been on many boards of arts organisations too. It's a requirement and an interesting concept indeed to consider. Our next speaker, ironically, I will declare, I'm a board member of his organisation. Hello, Anthony Peluso. Anthony is the Executive Director of Country Arts SA and one of the organisation's RAP champions. He will share his belief that the way we refocus our sector is by placing the local conversation at the core of our work. Please welcome Anthony.
Thanks, Kate. That wasn't awkward at all. Yes, I'd just like to start by acknowledging that we are gathered here today on the lands of Kaurna people, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. And like you, Kate, just say how great it is to be here. I feel like it's a big family gathering, and it's great to kind of see so many people together. So thank you to everyone who put the conference on, because it kind of is filling my soul just to see everyone in the room. And the panels that we've had today have both brought me joy and maybe depressed, and it's usually the way I feel about the arts sector on any given day. And what I want to share with you is all in my notes, but I know if I look at them, I'll probably get distracted. So I'll just really riff. And it's really about focusing, as Christy said, on the local. Working at Country Arts SA has really given me a deep opportunity to understand firsthand the impact of what we do in community, in people's lives every day. And it got to the point for me personally in the roles that I was undertaking at Country Arts, that I could see that our artistic choices made a massive difference in the take-up, in audience numbers, in engagement numbers. And what was key to offering arts experiences that people were drawn to and wanted to be part of was having a deeper understanding about how they ticked and what was important for them. And deeply understanding that, in fact, no two regional communities are the same. And and I know we have staff here in the room who will tell me this is, what they've been telling me every day, day in, day out. And so we've really kind of moved our focus to being part of those communities and trying to really understand what is relevant for those communities, and how does our expertise in arts and culture help them reflect and share their lives and their stories, and creating the opportunities for engagement in that process. And in some of the speakers today, there was a real deep understanding about how process is really a really big way of opening up the arts and culture to provide skills opportunities and to provide opportunities for individuals to build their own confidence and see themselves reflected, etc. And, if I was really cynical, I'd say I wanted us to do that because I knew in the end we might get some of those people to actually buy a ticket and come and see the show. But actually the whole process along the way, being part of the making of work, or being the part of the development or the research into making new work, or understanding how we can help to build local dance schools or local theatre outcomes, etc., was really the way to kind of cement our role in community. And for me, there's two big aspects of that. One being actually starting with the whole First Nations conversation. And it was great, again, this morning to start with Jacob and Daniel and Kirsty this morning, and really get back to what's important in this country, which is starting with our First Nations people. And, in preparing for today, I kind of really asked myself 3 questions about that. How can I and how can we at Country Arts work with First Nations artists and communities? How can we provide the support for them to work? And how can we get out of the way so that they can actually make arts and culture, share their culture, create new contemporary culture for all of us to be part of? And I applied the same set of logic around the local, the community. And of course, my perspective is a regional one and a diversity of regional ones, but the thinking applies equally, I believe, whether you work in a major capital city or you work in a small town. And that again is, how can I work with people on the ground, and how can I make that work part of their everyday lives? And I use the word work because that's our business, but how can we create those engagement opportunities, those moments when we come together that really are relevant to them, that resonate with them and what they want to create for themselves in terms of their own livelihoods and their communities. How can I also provide the support for that to happen more? And really, how can I just get out of the way? Because once you've had that exchange and you build that conversation and you impart those skills, I mean, the best way, as Julia Zamira was saying, is to kind of really just get out of the way and let each individual person take their own route in their own lives. And hopefully part of that is about sharing arts and culture. And probably if I end with just an example of that, and some of you in the room will know about this. And actually, before I go there is one comment I want to make. And so what I found is when we do that, when we remove ourselves, not put ourselves in the middle of the conversation, but actually start with the community, it gives us in the industry a new opportunity to work differently together. So rather than it being Country Arts, the organisation, stepping in and doing that research and then coming up with a great arts outcome, it's actually sharing that situation, whatever it happens to be, and seeing who else in the industry is interested in gathering together and creating a response around that topic or that idea or that story. And at Country Arts, we're very fortunate to work with quite a breadth of independent, small to mediums and majors across South Australia. And we do that to different success with different companies. But this year we were able to actually tour a work called Euphoria, which we had been working on since 2017, which actually went deeply into that process, working a lot with community and partnered with State Theatre Company. And that work is still reaping benefits and legacy. We get a lot of comments coming back, even months later, about the tour that we were able to deliver this year. And that work was presented not only in about 17 regional towns, and someone in the room will know that's the wrong number, but it's around that number, and also in Adelaide. But wherever it was presented, the themes of that play, which really resonated with our audiences, rang true, and we're still getting great responses back. And so my provocation really to all of you is, I want Country Arts to make many more friends in the sector, And for those of you who are interested in that concept of coming together to make something new that we can't make on our own, we're here. So thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. Rolling our sleeves up to sit down with the locals. I think I might actually join you, sit here. But first of all, I'm going to read out a couple of comments that are online in relation to what you've said today. Kate, in reference to what you've talked about, Elliot Bledsoe says, not to mention that the model rules for organisations in each state isn't very good, and organisers usually adopt them just as they are. You may know that, indeed. And that Mary Travis has said, boards at both government and large organisations mainly compromise leaders from the corporate sector. Having said that, I would have said today, there's a lot of you in the room, actually, Mary, that you might not know, there's a huge arts community in here, and many of them are on boards, which is reassuring. But she says that the personnel has become too narrow. As Kate Larson says, volunteers who often don't fully understand what's required to make present and work. We urgently need more arts knowledge on boards. And finally, Tiffany Lindell-Knight, in relation to what Greg mentioned, says an alternative model in Canada is that gambling profits are sequestered for charitable organisations, including registered arts organisations, and it's a hugely valuable resource. I believe we do have money coming through the lottery systems here, but agreed, in the UK and the US, the lottery money is equally complicated and has its own flaws, but a lot does fund the arts. So over to you now. Questions or comments for the panel or for anything else you've seen today? There's a roving mic here, and we've got a mic for the panel. So can I take any questions, any thought-provoking comments from what's happened here? It's got to be yes. Okay, great. Will, is it? I can't see you with the mask on yet. Great. Here comes a mic.
Thanks so much, everybody. I'm Will Peterson. Kate, this question is for you and anybody else who wants to weigh in. As you were going through this I wrote down checklist of the qualities of the bad board. Yep. So there are a lot of boards, everyone's shaking their heads while you were talking. And, I think most of us have been on either or both sides of the boards, or we've worked for boards. And many of them do have, in some, it's shocking, some of them have all of the qualities that you mentioned, right? So I'm wondering, at the end, you said what we need are fit for purpose models. And it struck me that as somebody who's in the business of advising boards, you're in a better position than most of us to have some thoughts in that area, fit for purpose models.
Exactly the thought exercise that I'm going to be working on over starting with
Is that my phone?
Is that any better? There we go. Did you hear that? So this is that's the answer I'm going to be trying to work towards this year. And ultimately, at the moment, we're doing that bending without breaking things. So there are boards playing with innovation in this area, but they are still eventually hit the legislative guidelines. So really what we need to do is some research into the models and make the argument to then evoke legislative change. But what those models might look like, we can draw from other countries and other sectors. So implementing different boards for different purposes, implementing centralized hub models to reduce governance duplication in the same way we reduce duplication in other areas, or I think most significantly, outsourcing governance oversight in the same way we already have a model to outsource our financial oversight in the form of our annual audits. So I think there's already lots of models that we can explore. But yeah, I'm looking forward to getting stuck into that over this next year.
Sorry, can I just add to that? Because the point about the constraints of legislation is spot on. And earlier this year, the state government reviewed the Associations and Corporation Act, their first review for 30 years. And the first that anyone in our sector or any other sector heard about it was when we were presented with 30 pages of legal amendments to the Act. Total missed opportunity to sit down with the sectors and say, what do you want out of the Act? like that first step of consultation about, yeah, what's the model? Instead, we got these huge proposals that were just tightening the act, including, wonderfully enough, mandatory rules where they would write rules that would override whatever was in your constitution. Between the Arts Industry Council, the Conservation Council and SACOS, we've managed to tone back a lot of that stuff, but and it's in Parliament now, and we don't know what will happen to it. It'll probably just get parked. But if it does get parked, it will give us an opportunity next year to go back and say, can we start from square one and actually do exactly that sort of talking about what we want?
Does anyone know if it's legislated that we need to report in annual reports complaints? Or is it is?
Yes, it is. It is actually listed as a mandatory requirement. So obviously government prefers to hear the bad news or the complaints from the public. And there's no doubt reasons for that have been built up over the years. But for me, it just sort of seems only logical to balance that with, if you're going to value that as some sort of performance measure or means of assessing the performance of an institution, then it also needs to be balanced by the positive feedback comments.
Just to add, so the big institutions are governed by their own acts of parliament. So it's slightly, not every incorporated association needs to go home and worry about reporting their complaints in their next annual
No,
report.
of course, of course. No, that's right. In fact, only 3 organisations, I think you called on, wasn't it, that were doing it?
My field of research is really on the major institutions, sort of as in some ways, the leading, the leaders of the sector, the examples that are held up for management and professional development and training. And you'd like to think board practice as well. I haven't had much experience in that regard, but yes, the ones that I saw were the festival, the museum, the gallery, and the library. Fringe didn't have to report complaints. Their setup is completely different. So I do acknowledge it's horses for courses, and it wouldn't really have much of an effect on government or the public if just one institution didn't hand in their annual report 1 year, or just delayed it until there was provision made to include more analysis of the public, positive comments.
There's no doubt legislative requirements around timing too, probably. Greg, how often, once every 30 odd years, or what would actually provoke another review of legislation?
I'm in two minds. If the legislation doesn't get through, which could just be a timing issue, given there's not many sitting days left, then the government will probably want to reintroduce it in the next parliament. But that will give us a chance then to actually go, we actually do a review, not a tweaking of the Act. But apart from that, it's just going to be political pressure from the peak bodies largely, I think.
I think that might be a call to action, but that wasn't deliberate. Anyone else? Great. Maz?
Look, I agree with many of the points you made, Kate, about boards, and I've been on several, and that some of them are a disaster. But I guess for me, at the core of them often is this sort of idea of civic participation and community governance. And so I guess I'm interested for me, sometimes it's not necessarily that the boards are a bad idea, and having public oversight and public participation in these institutions is a good thing, but we're just not committed often, that it is just sometimes a lack of commitment and a lack of understanding, and possibly because the legislation is so complicated and we just don't know. So I guess I'm just probably more of a comment, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts, that we don't lose all the good things as well that come with that, that board model.
Yeah, and thank you for saying that. It's really hard to have this conversation, especially in 7 minutes, because there's so many things to be critical of. But it's also important to note that it's based entirely on generosity and civic participation, and extraordinary things happen and extraordinary people make a difference, especially in a sector that is so under-resourced, that we are being propped up by the generosity of these volunteers. So it's about walking that line between making it possible for the generosity and the time and the energy of those volunteers to go where we need it to go, in a way that is rewarding for them as well. Like, we don't want to make our board meetings completely about compliance and sitting in a room and reading. Like, we don't want that, but we also don't want people to give our board members free rein to making programming decisions and causing all sorts of havoc. So yeah, it's really about trying to find that fine line between keeping those good things, but building scaffolding around it to ensure that's all we get and we can get rid of the other stuff.
That's interesting. I think you've proposed that there could be new models that are bespoke, let's say, for different organisations. I appreciate that's not legislatively allowed, but
Yet.
it's interesting because what some organisations do need networks and contacts, and some need help with specific things. And yeah, it's not a cookie cutter model, perhaps, going forward. Interesting comments, Julianne. Where's the mic? Thanks, Edwin down here. Oh, sorry, Julianne first, and then I'll go up to Vince, and then we'll have to. Oh, you're pointing. Sorry.
Okay, it's another question about boards, but I'm really interested in, is what is happening at board level a reflection of this bigger discussion that we're having today about neoliberalism and conservatism within sort of broader culture and government and politics? And, we've seen that reflected down through the Australia Council, through the last 20 years. And I guess I'm really interested in how, that shift is influencing how arts and culture are operating at board level. But that seems to be part of this much broader neoliberalism sort of ideology.
I mean, sure. But really what I see on a grassroots level is it's much more micro than that. Like the boards are just having the same, so many of the boards are having the same problems and they're having them again and again and again. And they get on top of it and then they change over and then they go back into the cycle. So I really, in most cases, I just don't think they people have got their head above water enough to even engage in the bigger conversation. I think we've got so much work to do on the groundwork because we're all working on unsteady and not fit for purpose ground at the moment.
Anthony?
I just add something. I mean, notwithstanding your whole premise about not needing a board, but I mean, I think there are things that, I feel fortunate at Country Arts where our board is established and it's running, and we have the opportunity, as Christy knows, that we ensure there's a younger person on the board who kind of joins into the conversation and actually builds skills about what it means to be on a board. Because actually when you've got a skilled board, it's actually great. That can be really quite effective. But it is about, it's a lot of training. And I know my first board position was really a training opportunity for me to understand what is my role here actually on this board.
Thank you. I wonder what we haven't talked about, right, is how the board could influence the bigger change that we're all here to discuss as well, and fundamentally advocate for or help reset the whole conditions for the arts. I can take one more question and then we're going to wrap. Any other comments? There's one last one.
Thank you. My name's Matthew. I'm new to the art sector. So I just come from a community service background. And one of the things that has been really big is around measuring health and well-being. And I think arts and culture contributes to health and well-being. So the talk about how we measure what we do, and I think we should really be focusing more about how art and culture contributes to the health and well-being of our community. So there are tools around to do that, and I think that changing how we measure what we do could make a big difference. It's more positive and it's more, can't be argued, because there's lots of studies that show that people that volunteer or are connected or get involved in doing something are better off mentally and physically. And I think it can, arts and culture can be, a good way of showing how, it's a positive health outcome. So
Thank you. Yeah. I'll take that as a comment. All right, can you please join me in thanking this group? All right. Stay put, stay where you are. We don't have